Independent audio manufacturers have really come a long way, and this is proof of that. Let's get into it. I'm DMS, you're watching The Headphone Show, and if you leave a comment down below on this video, you just might see your comment in the intro of the next video. Wow, things have come a long way. This is the Auribus Acoustics Sierra. Now, Juan has made a few revisions to this headphone over time. You may remember a while back I reviewed a headphone called Everest. This was the first Auribus Acoustics headphone, and since then they've designed this, and well, it's been through some revisions. I actually really like the sort of minimalist style box art that just has the headphone, the logo, and the name. You see the grill pattern on the side there, hand built in California, and on the back we have this 340 grams without the cable, which is pretty close to the measurement I get around 347. We can check that in just a minute. 20 ohms at 1 kilohertz, that is also correct, though it does vary. We'll also get into that. Aircraft grade aluminum, that's pretty cool. And we have this frequency response here. Now, this is a little bit different than you'd expect from most mainstream rigs. This is a clone rig, so we will go more into frequency response later in this video. I've measured this also on the Brulin Care 4128C head and torso simulator. Inside that there is a carrying case with some accessories, these small little 6.3 millimeter adapters, a case for the cable with a magnetic lid on it, and then as you can see I've already taken the headphones out of the box. In fact, they've been out of the box for a while because I've been listening to them and testing them. Let's talk about building comfort, then I will talk about how they sound, and then we'll put these on the bench, measure them, and talk about frequency response. These are 3D printed, a process that we're seeing more and more in the headphone space, and a process that I actually have a lot of personal respect for. I forgot to ask Juan if this is SLS or MJF, but it's definitely one of the two. I would lean towards MJF, but really it could be either. We have that aircraft aluminum right here on the grills that looks like it's probably at least 2 millimeters thick of aluminum. 2.1 millimeters, yeah, so pretty much right at 2 millimeters thick. We have some acoustic mesh behind that. We also see acoustic mesh all the way around the headphone on the top and on the bottom. There's dual 3.5 millimeter entry down here. The headphones swivel but retain their position after a certain point. They tilt and can tilt all the way around, but they're not very floppy. They seem to hold their shape pretty well, which is a nice feature. The adjustment mechanism is pretty smooth. It just slides back and forth. And you can tell right inside here, while this is aluminum on top, there are lines right underneath here for what I believe might be TPU or some other type of filament for the interior of this headband component between the aluminum and this HD800S style headband pad. Either way, the adjustment mechanism is smooth, it holds pretty firmly, and the weight distribution, it's actually really nice. This thing feels great on the head. It doesn't weigh a ton, and nowhere do I actually get hot spots. So the ears feel good, the headband feels good, all across the board, even with glasses on, this thing feels great. As far as weight is concerned without cable, right here I'm getting 348 grams on my little Amazon scale. On my calibrated scale in the back, I was getting 347, which is pretty dang close. So that's within 10 grams of what's advertised. The pads are nice and deep, and actually the ear cups extend in deeper than the pads actually go. I'll take one of these pads off and show you this. This is a really unique design. So we get acoustic mesh on the top and on the bottom where it connects up to these vents right here. And we also have acoustic mesh right here on the back. That's where this connects to the outside right here behind this mesh and behind the aluminum grill. We get a sneak peek of the driver back in here, which let's zoom in on this a little bit. This whole driver is actually elevated in here. Everything else recesses around it. Then you see the driver set back in behind this sort of cover. There's a felt covering on it here with multiple layers of different things going on, and an opening right here where you can actually see the driver down in there just a little bit. This is a really cool design. It has pretty low acoustic impedance to the outside air, so when you're actually wearing it, you can still hear the outside pretty well. It's not a very restrictive design. One piece of feedback I had is that these are actually round pads that are fitting onto more of an oval shaped mount, and apparently this mounting piece has been made a little bit more round to make the pads fit on a little bit better, since the version that I'm holding here. You can also see on the inside there is a left indicator and some text right in here that says patent pending, Auribus Acoustics, and assembled in California right there on the inside of the cup. A lot of small elements of this design are giving me HD800/HD800S vibes, and I think that that is for a good reason. One of the things that one was really going for here is low acoustic impedance and really, really good channel matching. Two things that the HD800S is really known for outside of just its soundstage. And these are both things that he's achieved here. This has really, really good channel matching and low acoustic impedance. All across the board, you can tell that this isn't made by a massive company with a bajillion-dollar budget, but it still feels pretty refined. It doesn't look like anything else in the industry. It has its own unique aesthetic. It feels good on the head, it feels good in the hand, and especially in the areas that matter, there is good attention to detail. Now, of course, I could definitely see areas where this could be refined. This mechanism, while it does hold, it's a little bit rougher than I would like for it to be. Like maybe some sort of a sticker in here that would give it more consistent rotating friction, but that's just nitpicking. This is definitely a headphone made by hand by a startup that is using pretty advanced 3D printing technologies. So when I say 3D printing, I'm not talking about like the kind of 3D printer you can put in your basement. You're not going to have an SLS or an MJF machine at home. They are very expensive, and 3D printing like this is not cheap to do. This is significantly more expensive per unit than if you were doing something like injection molding, or even in many cases more expensive than if you were to mill these components with a CNC out of aluminum. And the benefits are that this is going to be a material that allows you to do very unique shapes, like this sort of headband yoke right here, the internals of this chassis all in one piece, and it's going to be lightweight. Those are all really cool. Let's talk about sound, and then we'll talk about measurements and frequency response. This, funny enough, I'm gonna make a lot of comparisons to the HD800, is a pretty great headphone. It's not perfect, and in many ways, I think people are gonna point to this and say it's HD800 at home, but there are ways where I think this is actually a better headphone than the HD800 or the HD800S. Then there's areas where it's a worse headphone than the HD800 or HD800S. But the fact that it is comparable to that headphone at all, I think, is very, very high praise for what Auribus Acoustics has accomplished. So one of the key points that they wanted to tackle with this headphone was having really good bass extension and really good treble extension, just being able to go very far out in both directions before it rolls off. And this does accomplish that. The bass on this headphone is immaculate. This is actually the same driver that I'm using in the Omega headphone, so it's that Peerless 50, and that is a great driver. Now, they are doing some special electrical filter stuff in this headphone, which you'll see when we do the impedance sweep on it, and that's helping it get better bass extension overall. It really shows when you're listening to it. This has Harman-like bass. It is just really, really clean, really well extended. It doesn't bleed into the mid-range at all. The mid-range sounds really, really smooth. So you get crazy good bass extension and a bass shelf without adding warmth to it. We get into the treble and we start to get a little bit of a recess in the upper mid-range lower treble, kind of like what you would get with an HD800. And then the treble starts to elevate back up from there. And it's more what I would describe as neutral bright or Harman with a little bit of extra treble. And this is where it's going to be a little bit more divisive, because this has very, very similar treble to the HD800S, but with a better mid-range and better bass. Now, for a lot of people, that's going to be more treble than they want. And for a lot of people, it's going to be exactly what they want. That upper treble region, in fact, probably everything from like 4 kilohertz and up is going to be pretty close to diffuse field, which is similar to the Sennheiser HD800S. Now, there are some key differences there in terms of sound. This doesn't just sound like an HD800S with better mid-range and better bass. The staging is totally different. The 800S is a lot wider. The 800S is a lot more imaging capable. So the 800S really puts you in that kind of wild sonic soundscape, whereas this is more what I would describe as a monitor headphone. In fact, this is a headphone that I would actually encourage professionals working on music to use, or just people who want a close to accurate representation of what their music sounds like. It is a lot like Genelec the headphone. Well, I guess Genelec actually is making a headphone now. If Genelec wasn't making a headphone, I would say this is like the Genelec headphone, which again, high praise for it. That, however, means that there will be songs you listen to that are going to sound too bright. There's songs you're going to listen to that are going to sound sibilant or harsh or sharp, and that isn't always the case. This is nowhere near as much treble as you're getting out of things like Bayer Dynamics. And since the treble as a whole sort of elevates together, aside from that one little recessed region, it doesn't sound like there's like crazy narrow spikes that come out of nowhere. It's pretty predictable when it's going to bite. It's not just going to jump out at you. If you're listening to a song that's louder and has more treble in it, you're going to notice that long before it gets to a point where you're like, oh, that's sibilance. And as a result, I find myself listening a little bit quieter on these, but it's not unpleasant. In fact, I would say that this is a better sounding headphone overall than things like the Meze 109 Pro. I would also say that this is a better sounding headphone than the Focal Clear. Now, the Clear is more dynamic sounding. The Clear is certainly more premium in terms of its construction, but this is more comfortable than the Clear. This has better bass and better mid-range than the Clear. This has better lower mid-range than the Clear, because the Clear can sound a little bit shouty at times, a little bit of glare, and this doesn't do either of those things. This is very much like if someone is a big fan of the sound of studio monitors wanted a headphone. And this is what I would point them towards. Timbre can be a little bit weird sometimes. For the most part, timbre is really good because that mid-range remains intact. But I think that there are some headphones out there that are warmer leaning that have a little bit better timbre through the low mids. Regardless, I think the timbre on these sounds great, and I have spent many hours just listening to my music library without skipping tracks. Just I'll shuffle my whole library, let it play from song to song to song, and there's plenty of tracks that I would normally probably skip that I just let play on these, and I enjoyed it the entire time. In fact, Juan doesn't know it yet, but I'm probably going to add these to my collection because I actually do really enjoy listening to this. So that's a person, myself, who generally likes treble to be a little bit more subdued than this. But these are just really good at what they do. So let's take a step back. Let's look at this from a measurements perspective, and I'll put these on the Brulin Care 4128C. Let's look at the frequency response and the impedance sweeps on a DATS. So here's the frequency response. As you can see in the bass, they are pretty dang Harman. We even get a little bit of that 200 Hertz-ish dip here that's characteristic of a lot of Harman stuff. Linear mid-range from there on up. Then in the upper mid-range, lower treble, we start to kind of dip down right here between 2 and 3 kilohertz, very similar to what you get on like the HD800S. The treble elevates back up and stays relatively linear within a ballpark here. We have this peak, which pretty much occurs on almost all headphones in the 4128C, so I'm not inclined to believe that there is a massive peak there. I believe that's more the measurement rig than anything. And then we start to roll back down a little bit. Now, this does maintain a pretty decent volume before it rolls off harder, and this is a 711 rig, so it's going to be less accurate over 10 kilohertz, but regardless, we still get pretty dang good treble extension and definitely incredible bass extension on an open back dynamic. I mean, this is not the kind of frequency response in the bass that you can normally get out of an open back headphone, especially not an open back dynamic headphone. Normally, if you want to get bass extension even remotely like that, it's going to be bumped more into the low mid-range right here and start rolling off way faster in the sub bass. And it's going to be a very warm sounding headphone. This instead becomes very articulated. It maintains clean bass and a clean mid-range all the way throughout, which is very impressive. Now, here it is next to the HD800S. So you can see here, they have similar treble, but the Auribus does have a little bit more energy at about 4.5 kilohertz. The HD800S dips more between 1K and 3K, and the HD800S is a lot warmer in its low mid-range and rolls off in the sub bass. So you can see where I'm making this comparison, where I think this, in a lot of ways, especially if you're just talking about in terms of frequency response, is like a better HD800S, or at least a more Harman-like HD800S. And the trade-off of not having that wild HD800 soundstage, having something that's a bit more monitor-like, is actually pretty good for me. I always felt like the HD800S, while it has really good soundstage, was a bit exaggerated. And I think that this is a bit more headphone-like, and I enjoy that. Now, I did also hook these up to a DATS so I could test the impedance curve, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So yes, we do hit 20 ohms around 1 kilohertz. The impedance increases dramatically in the bass, it's where we're getting that bass shelf. But then the impedance starts to go way down up here in the treble. Now, this isn't likely to be an issue if you're just listening to music, but if you're doing what I'm doing and you're running sweeps on a headphone, then you can encounter a problem, because at its lowest point, this hits around 7 ohms. that's very low impedance. And if you're, again, just listening to music, that's likely not gonna be an issue. If it is, your amp is probably just gonna shut off. But on some amps, like toppings or things like that, that can be a bit more unstable, this can be an issue. In fact, when I ran a sweep on this at 95 decibels, just a frequency sweep from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz on my test rig, my A90 died. It just shut off and it didn't turn back on. It's just dead. So the A90 is not stable when you give it that sort of an impedance load. Some other amps aren't also. Most well-made amps are gonna be fine, but that's just something to note. So if you are testing this headphone on a measurement fixture and you're using an amp that can be unstable at low impedances, you should be wary. This does go down to 7 ohms at 20 kilohertz. Which, by the way, if you need to upgrade to a better amp, you should check out headphones.com because, you know, they kind of make this whole channel possible. I mean, we got a lot of nice amps over there. Just saying. Or maybe a really nice 3.5mm Listen More cable. Okay, so I've had a lot of good and some bad to say about this thing. Overall, where does it stand? Honestly, again, I think this is a better, more well-rounded sounding headphone, at least acoustically, than something like a 109 Pro or a Focal Clear. I would take it over the Focal Identities that recently came out, with the drawback that this is something I have to power on an amp. My laptop is just not going to drive it, whereas something like the Identities I could easily plug up to my computer on the go, but this just sounds better. You have to be okay with that sort of kind of DIY or handmade feel that's becoming a little bit more popular with, well, these startup companies. So things like this, or the Modhouse Tungsten also kind of has this same feel. And again, I don't consider that to be a bad thing. I think that we're getting more people that are passionate about audio entering the space and building things like this that are competing with the big companies out there. So things like this and Tungsten, I'm really happy to see on the market, and they earn their place. They really do, because they're not starting out with millions and millions of dollars to just build whatever they want. These are guys who are really staying up late at night, putting tons and tons of hours into making great sounding products. And because of that, they're products that are also continuing to evolve and improve. That means they're not going to be perfect, but I really, really hope that guys like this, like Ryan from Modhouse Audio, a lot of these startup companies, or the guys HFA, I just saw them at the recent Can Jam SoCal. I really hope a lot of these guys stay in the industry, and 10 years from now, those are more of like the mainstay brands we start seeing at headphone shows, because they certainly have the capability of filling that spot. And that said, Auribus Acoustics is one of the ones I'm going to be keeping a close eye on. So in the end, do I recommend this headphone? Yes. Now that decision is going to be based on if all the criteria I listed meets your needs, but I feel very, very comfortable recommending the 2024 revision of the Sierra. So that is going to wrap up this video, guys. If you liked it, leave a like down below. Comment, let me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the community, get at the Discord or the forum, both available at the link in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around, subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Till next one, guys. Peace.